Welcome back to the Richard Syrett Show. He's been called the intellectual bulldozer behind U.S. President Donald Trump's economic revival plan. Steve Bannon called his latest book a tour de force of economic history, and President Trump himself reposted his article titled "Trump's Tariffs Will Create Millions of Jobs." Spencer Morrison is a lawyer, a sessional instructor of law, and the editor-in-chief of the National Economic Editorial. But more importantly, he's one of the clearest and most fearless voices making the case for America's return to economic sanity. In his provocative new book, Reshore, How Tariffs Will Bring Our Jobs Home and Revive the American Dream, Spencer dismantles the globalist mythology that's gutted the American middle class and left rural communities in ruins. He argues tariffs aren't just a tool, they're a weapon for national renewal and the foundation of any serious plan to reindustrialize, rebuild, and re-empower ordinary Americans. And today on the Richard Syrett Show, we're asking the hard questions. If tariffs really drive up prices, where's the inflation? Why did Mark Carney and Donald Trump keep their tariff détente a secret before Canada's election? And has Trump dropped the 51st state rhetoric, or is something else going on behind the curtain? Spencer Morrison, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on the program.
My pleasure. I want to get right to the heart of the media narrative. Why is it a myth that tariffs raise prices in the long run?
It's a very good question. I'll tackle it in two ways. So number one, let's look a bit at the economic history. And then number two, we're going to sort of look at the economic logic. So in order to answer the question, I think the best starting point is to look at what happened with tariffs historically and how did they affect prices in the long run, right? Because economic history should be our guideline when we're looking at policies, how they're going to work in the future. So let's go all the way back to the founding of the Republic, 1789. It's the first major piece of legislation in America. It's a Tariff Act. This was passed under presidency of George Washington. And it was under the advisement of this great guy, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote this work called The Report on Manufactures. In the Report on Manufactures, Hamilton outlined some of the problems that were facing the new nation. The main problem, as he saw it, was that America didn't make any of the goods that it needed in order to remain a self-sufficient country. So one of the big problems in the revolution is that the Revolutionary Army didn't have any firearms. They couldn't get their hands on firearms. They couldn't manufacture cannon. They couldn't manufacture the sails that they needed for their ships. All of this stuff was being imported from Europe, right? All of that advanced manufacturing. And that's a huge problem from the perspective of the founding fathers of a new nation. How can they defend America when America relies on Europe for all of the goods? So what they set out to do was to industrialize America so that America would become an economically self-sufficient country. So 1789 onwards, all throughout the 1800s, America begins to industrialize under something called the American system, which is sort of this Hamiltonian school of protectionist economics. American industry flourishes, and of course, during that period, America not only became the richest country in the world, it became the country with the largest industrial base in the world. Until you reach 1945, America's manufacturing half of everything in the world, right? So it was a very successful paradigm. And, the point about tariffs is during this period, America had the highest average tariffs on planet Earth. The highest average, over 30%. And this is an era before, before container ships. You think about that, 30% in an area where you're not shipping bulk goods, right? During that period, the cost of goods came down and down and down until, the American people were the richest per capita in the world. Best purchasing power, best quality of life. All of that happened under the highest tariffs in the world. Now let's fast forward. We jump to 1974. The tariffs are down. The gold window is closed. America embarks on this free trade experiment, let's call it. We've had high tariffs and barriers to entry for the whole history of the country. 1974, all of these are dropped. Ever since then, America's run a trade deficit every year. Cumulative value of these trade deficits, when you adjust for inflation, it's $28 trillion. $28 trillion. And that takes us to where we are now. We have the trade policy. The trade system is totally inverted, right? America used to be a high tariff nation with the cost of goods going down every single year. and the opposite has happened since 1974. So when people say tariffs are going to raise the cost of goods, I say, well, where's the evidence? Did the cost of goods go up in the 1800s or did they go down? We have 150 years of economic history showing that America can prosper under tariffs. Conversely, we have 50 years of economic history that shows the cost of living has actually gone up under the so-called free trade paradigm. So economic history as our guide shows us that in the long run, tariffs are not going to increase prices. Does that make sense from a historical perspective?
From an historical perspective, yes. And we're all familiar with the Harry Truman quote about economists. Something, if you line them up between here and the moon, they're still wrong. But you still have all of these economists on CNN and CNBC saying the exact opposite, and just doubling and tripling down on this mantra that this is going to be inflationary. But just going back to America thriving under high tariffs for over a century. Just to play devil's advocate, is it possible that, in this case, correlation isn't causation? How do we know tariffs were the reason for America's industrial success and not just, good timing?
Yeah, I think there's, I think that's a really good counterpoint. How do we know that tariffs were an important part of the success? Well, two reasons, okay? So number one, we're not just looking at American economic history. Obviously, our own economic past is important. But when you look at throughout the 1800s and heck, all the way up until the early 2000s, if you look at the industrial development of other countries, for example, South Korea, Japan, Germany, all of these countries really followed the exact same paradigm in how they got rich. And that was, sort of something called this import substitution, where high tariffs were raised, significant capital investments were made in domestic industry, either privately or publicly, depends on the country. But in either case, all of these countries protected their markets. So a good example of this is South Korea. People they love to compare South Korea to North Korea. North Korea is poor because it's communist. South Korea is rich because it's capitalist. There's a little more to it than that, though, because South Korea is not a free trading nation. South Korea had some of the highest tariffs in the world when it was industrializing. In fact, the tariff rate, the average tariff rate in the 1960s and 70s, 80s, is over 40%. Not only that, but they were manipulating their currency to keep it artificially low. So a lot of American money poured into South Korea to take advantage of the cost of doing business, and of course, South Korea had protected markets to create a domestic market for their own products, and that's sort of how that South Korean industry developed in the exact same way that America's industry originally developed. And if you look at Germany, the economic history of Germany, it's the exact same thing. So it's not just the economic history of the states. There's lots and lots of other examples of countries developing in this way. It's a tried and true method. I mean, China since 2001 is a great example of that, right?
So I've heard U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent make this argument, this counter-argument to the inflation argument, and that is that the consumer in the United States, for example, doesn't pay the tariff. The country that's exporting to the United States, the government somehow absorbs that cost. Does that make sense? And if so, I mean, how does that work?
It depends on the industry by industry, and it's partially true. So tariffs are obviously a tax on imports. If you're bringing a good into the country, the cost from that original country is what the tariff is charged on, right? So if, say, for example, you have a toaster, and the toaster sells for $10 in China, we buy it for $10, we sell it for $60 here. 10% tariff isn't going to be $6. It's not the tariff on the sticker price, it's on the price from China, so that original $1, right? So that's sort of how tariffs work, on the tariffs for dummies, let's say. Now, who pays that tariff? There's a lot of research that's been done. Typically, it's a bit of both. So the producer will pay part of the tariff, the consumer may pay part of the tariff. It really depends on the type of product and how much margins there are on the product. And the reason for this is because foreign producers, they really, really want to have access to America's market. You got to remember, America's consumer market's biggest in the world. Everybody wants in, right? So people are going to pay to play, essentially. Now, if there's high tariffs on a country like China, for example, and lower tariffs on a country like India, but they're both competing for market space in America, the Chinese producers know that they can't pass all of that tax onto the consumers. So what they're going to do is they're going to cut the margins on their end and eat some of that cost. So some of the data came out, for example, I'll give you some hard numbers. 25%, so 1 in 4 importers of manufactured goods, they ate 100% of the tariff cost, 100% of it. So Americans didn't pay a dime. On the flip side, about a third of them said they were passing on almost all of the costs to the consumers, and then the other, most people were somewhere in the middle. Depends on the industry. So there's some truth to that, but ultimately it depends on the good, what the margins are like, whether there's price arbitrage differences between countries that are selling the same product. So it's very complicated ultimately.
Right. Is part of the mechanism as well that by reshoring, in other words, bringing industry to your shores in order to circumvent the tariffs, you're creating jobs, you're driving up salaries, income, which outpaces the inflation?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's what we'd like to do. So I'll give you a good example. So since 2001, that's when China joined the World Trade Organization. Since 2001, over 60,000 factories have closed. They moved abroad, mostly to China. We lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs. And on top of that, we lost about 5 to 7 million jobs that were supported by those manufacturing jobs. So a factory is an anchor industry. It brings in money into a community, sort of like a farm or a mine does, supports the whole rest of the economic ecosystem. When that goes, all the barber shops, lawyers, everybody that depends on that factory for the community, all those jobs disappear too. So there's a big multiplier effect for industrial jobs. That's why we love heavy industry. That's why we love factories for job creation. So the problem is that when those jobs go, you have a whole sort of economic collapse on top of that, right? So the impact from that offshoring is it's significantly more than the original jobless numbers make it out to be.
Right. Because globalists, they argue that Americans benefit from cheaper goods made in China, but this is sort of what you're, I think, alluding to. This is a lie. The cheap goods illusion. Break that down for us.
Yeah. So there's two parts to it. First of all, the goods aren't cheap. They're just cheaply made. We got to understand that because we have to look at the life cycle of a product. A good example of this is like a household appliance, like a dishwasher, refrigerator. You expect to have a dishwasher and refrigerator your whole life, right? You want to have that piece of, you want the appliance for at least 20, 30 years, ideally. In the old days, these machineries that were built in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, you could get a 20-year lifetime warranty, 30-year warranty. Even your standard manufacturer's warranty was going to be 10 years. Warranties have totally collapsed. 1 in 4 refrigerators fails within the first 4 years. Extended warranties are now like 5 years. Manufacturers aren't standing behind their products because they know they're breaking. So if you look at the life cycle of the product, you say, look, I got a refrigerator, I'm going to have it for 30 years. In the old days, the good old days, you bought it one time, you had it, you could service it if you need to. Now you're buying the refrigerator 2, maybe 3, sometimes 4 times. So is it cheaper or are you just buying it extra? If you look at the timeline, a longer timeline, goods are more expensive now than they used to be. They're more expensive now than they used to be because, the quality got down. And then the second part of that is wages. So wages have stagnated ever since 1973. And the reason for that is because we have wage competition with these, low-wage countries. Like how is an American factory supposed to compete on price point with somebody in China who makes 1/24th what the American makes? It's not possible. So that drives wages down. And as a result, that stops the amount of purchasing power that your people have.
So let's talk about the 1980s for a moment. President Ronald Reagan, he embraced free trade. Was that an historic blunder in hindsight? And what would America look like today had America stuck with a tariff-based model?
Well, so in terms of Ronald Reagan, so the damage had already started before that. We're talking, 1970s is when things really start to come unglued. It picks up pace in the 1990s, of course, with NAFTA, 1994, China, 2001, WTO. The 1980s was, in some ways, it was sort of like the heyday of the American middle class. But at that point, it's important to remember we were coasting on fumes. We were coasting on fumes at that point. For sort of a counterfactual, if you were looking at, what would wages today look like if people were earning the same that they were back then on purchasing power parity, we'd be way better off. Your average or your median family would probably be earning about, I'll have to look. I'll have to look for the specific number, but your average person is about $9,000 richer in their pocket every year in terms of income. And of course, households consist of more than one person, so we're talking about quite a bit of money at the end of the day. And it's not only that, but the cost of goods is also lower, right?
But you're claiming that tariffs won't just bring jobs back. They're going to help restore community cohesion, family formation, even mortality. That's a pretty bold statement. Can you walk us through how economics shape culture in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So the economy touches every aspect of your day-to-day life. It's not a pie in the sky thing. The economy affects what sort of jobs are available to you, what sort of education and employment opportunities are available to your children, the type of food that's on the shelves, the type of food you can afford. All of those things are impacted by the economy, right? So let's look, for example, at the standard American diet. It's a really good, it's really bad news, actually. The bad news is that we can't afford to eat like we used to in the 1970s, right? So consumption of red meat, consumption of eggs, consumption of butter and lard, healthy animal fats, all of those are way, way, way down, down by a third, down by a quarter. Meanwhile, the consumption of alternative substitute products like vegetable oils, those are way up. Vegetable oils in that same period are up by 87%, for example. So what's happening is people are substituting high quality cooking fats like butter and lard and tallow. They're substituting it for canola oil, Crisco, things like that. In the kitchen, they do the same sort of thing, right? But in your body, they react in very different ways. And of course, vegetable oil, seed oils, they're a much inferior product, to the real thing, healthy animal fats. The problem is that if you wanted to eat like somebody in the 1970s, steak, butter, good bacon, and all of that, you couldn't afford it. You'd be paying 2 to 3 times more today for food than you're currently paying, which is just not feasible for most people, right? And that has had downstream effects on our health. Male testosterone levels have been going down by about 1% per year, likely in part due to the fact that we're consuming less healthy animal fats and cholesterol, things like that. Cancer rates, the rate of obesity, diabetes, all of these are up, and they're up, frankly, in lockstep with the consumption of seed oils. Seed oils are very bad for you, right? And then if you look at mortality rates, and this is where it gets really interesting, I'll let you take a guess. What was the longest lived generation in human history? When were they born? When do you think they were born?
I would say just post World War II.
That's a really good guess. You got to go back farther, though.
Oh.
It was the people who were born in the 1860s to 1880s. Those people were, on average, the longest lived generation when you account for infant mortality. So if you made it past like the age of 5, you are likely to make it longer than any other generation in human history. And the reason for that is because they had really, really good, healthy diets. And they were physically active, all sorts of stuff. But it's interesting, right? Because if we were able to afford to eat the sorts of diets that we were eating back then, that's going to have downstream effects on our testosterone levels, on longevity, and our health in general. And a healthy America is you need to have a physically healthy America if you're going to have a mentally healthy America.
All right, and then that feeds into community cohesion, family formation. In what way?
Well, healthy people. So it's one of these interesting things. in sort of the social science literature. And in my day job, I'm a divorce lawyer, right? So I deal with a lot of these issues, every single day. One of the main reasons that families sort of break apart is money, right? Oftentimes the dad loses his job or takes a big pay cut. It causes a whole bunch of downstream problems. The opioid epidemic, for example. I don't think it's possible to say that we can blame opioids on NAFTA, but NAFTA didn't help, right? Because you had 800,000 people, mostly men, lose their jobs, and their lives fall apart, right? Because often, they couldn't afford to put good food on the table. Their wives left them. A lot of people went on welfare, Social Security. People, started faking disabilities, all sorts of stuff, and it just caused a whole cascade of social problems, all from sort of a concentrated area of people losing their jobs. Lots of negative downstream effects. Divorce rates went way up. People, drug use went up, especially in those areas. It's really a horrible thing, right? But when somebody loses their job, especially the breadwinner of a family, when they lose their job and they can't get another one, it causes huge, huge family problems. And when you multiply that across 800,000, a million people, it's causing social problems.
So you say we can reclaim America. I'm a Canadian, so reclaim your country. How is that done in practice? I mean, what kinds of tariffs are we talking about? How high, and on what industries?
No, my family is American. I live in Alberta, though.
All right, fellow Canuck. All right.
Yeah, I wouldn't say. I'd say Albertan. I'll say Albertan.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Sorry, the question.
So what kind of tariffs specifically should America be looking at, and how high should they be, and on what industries specifically?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. In my view, the tariffs, they've got to be stable. It's the first thing. Right now, there's just a lot of back and forth on what the tariff rate is going to be. We punch it up to 145%, then it goes down to 50%. Now it's at 10%. That's not good because nobody knows, whether they're going to invest, right? Because, you might not want to invest domestically at 10%, but at 50%, you want to build a factory, right? So without forward-looking guidance for businesses, they're not going to invest. They're just going to try to wait the presidency out, right? So tariffs have got to be stable. The second thing is they've got to be high, and they've got to be uniformly high across the developing world at bare minimum. What we don't want to see is tariffs raised high on China, and then they're kept low on India. All that's going to do is it's going to create a heavy incentive for those factories to move from China to India. But that's not the point. The point is to bring them back to America, to reshore that industry, right? So the tariffs need to be uniformly high, and they need to be uniformly stable across the board.
So Canada's manufacturing sector has also been hollowed out, especially in places like southern Ontario. Do you think Canada should follow America's lead and adopt aggressive tariffs to revive its own middle class?
The interesting thing is that Canada industrialized and became one of the world's largest industrial powers on the back of the national policy of Sir John A. Macdonald. The key, there was two core components to the national policy. There was tariffs, and there was the settlement of the West. So Canada really did prosper under a high tariff regime. And I think frankly, it would be wise for them to do it again, especially when you're dealing with all these low-cost imports from China, because the same thing that's happening in America is happening in Canada as well. In fact, it's happening all across the Western world. If you want to look at what Canada is going to look like industrially and economically, just look to Great Britain. They're about 20, 30 years ahead. They just closed their last steel mill down.
So the Trudeau-Carney government doubled down on free trade, climate mandates. They punished domestic production. Is there any hope for Canadian industry without a political revolution in Ottawa?
I think the decline in Canada's industry is actually orchestrated and very deliberate. I think the government is in favor of deindustrializing Canada in lockstep with sort of the World Economic Forum directives. So yeah, I don't think there's any hope for the Canadian economy without change at the top. I mean, if you look at some of the policies, uh, the green energy policies, the carbon tax. I mean, those are all important. They're doing all sorts of things. I mean, they're effectively capping in Alberta, for example. These guys are capping the amount of oil that they want us to mine. They're preventing us from, shipping it abroad. They're preventing pipelines. So the Liberal government in general is just very anti-business, and it's causing a lot of economic hardship for the Canadian people.
So I want to address the early conversation that Mark Carney, now our Prime Minister, reportedly had with Donald Trump, where Trump apparently reassured him that tariffs wouldn't target Canada. Why do you think this conversation was kept quiet until after the election?
I don't want to sound like too much of a conspiracy theorist. And I can't speculate on what the Trump administration is doing. Obviously, I'm not a member of the Trump administration. From an outsider looking in, I get the sense that President Trump probably wanted Mark Carney to win. That's what it looks like to me, and I don't know why. I think probably, President Trump actually usually has a fairly good working relationship with these sort of liberal elite type guys. He's probably familiar with Mark Carney from his work with the Bank of England, and Mark Carney is sort of a known figure that Trump probably thought he could have a good working relationship with. So I think that sort of makes sense. Part of me also thinks that maybe he wanted to stoke the Alberta independence movement, which really got going after the election of Mark Carney. So, we can, from the perspective of an Albertan who would love to have a free country, thanks, Donald.
Trump seems to have dropped the Canada is the 51st state rhetoric lately anyway. Do you think that's because of this quiet tariff détente with Carney, or is Trump just playing, 4D chess again, keeping Canada close while reshoring jobs to America?
I would be very surprised if Trump actually wanted Canada to be a state. It would flip the balance of power in favor of the Democrats, no question about it. So I think a lot of it's just rhetoric. Whether or not he'd want Western Canada, maybe that's a different story, I guess.
Reshore, how tariffs will bring our jobs home and revive the American dream. Spencer, how do we get a copy?
So we've got a beautiful second edition that's just come out on Amazon. It's also available on paperback, so everybody should get a copy of that. This is really the blueprint on how to reindustrialize, not just America, but reindustrialize Canada and reindustrialize the West in general. So, if you want to have a strong economic future for yourself, for your children, your grandchildren, you got to understand how to make that happen. This book lays it out for you.
And how can we read your article, Trump's Tariffs Will Create Millions of Jobs?
So follow me. So I've got all of my work available on my Substack, and I post all the articles on my X account. It's just at Real SP Morrison.
Fantastic. Spencer, great speaking with you. Appreciate your time.
Richard, a pleasure. Thanks.
Hey, this is Richard Syrett. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe.